Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining today's discussion on year one of the Biden administration. My name is Tara Parwana, and I am a first-year MPP candidate at the Harris School of Public Policy. Tonight, I have the distinct pleasure of introducing our incredible panel of speakers who will discuss the wins, challenges, and the future of the Biden administration. While we all wish we could be in person for this conversation, I have no doubt that this group will guide us through a thoughtful reflection of the past year and what we might expect in the years ahead. First, we have Laura Barron Lopez. Ms. Barron Lopez has built a career in political reporting for several organizations, including the Washington Examiner, HuffPost, and The Hill. She is currently a White House correspondent at Politico and serves as a CNN political analyst. Next, we have Ashley Parker, who is a White House correspondent for the Washington Post and on-air contributor to NBC News and MSNBC. Ms. Parker previously spent 11 years at the New York Times, where she covered the 2012 and 2016 presidential campaigns and Congress. Our last panelist is Sabrina Siddiqui, who is a White House reporter for the Wall Street Journal and covers the Biden presidency. Previously, Ms. Siddiqui covered the White House and the 2016 presidential election at The Guardian. Moderating today's discussion is the founding director of the Institute of Politics, David Axelrod, who needs no formal introduction. I want to extend a sincere thank you to all of tonight's panelists for your time, and I will speak on behalf of the full audience in saying that we really look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, there we go. Tara, thank you. And Tara will be back at the end of our panel discussion when we open the floor to your questions. So we can look forward to that. Good to see you all. Ashley, you're speaking from the Post. Is that where you're?
Yes, and I want to apologize. It's just like a totally empty newsroom because of COVID, so the lights are off in a way that I can't seem to figure out how to turn them back on.
But it's a perfect setup for the discussion, right? Because we're 1 year in. It was a year ago that President Biden was inaugurated, and a lot of his discussion was about bringing the country together in this battle against COVID. Let's just go around the room and talk about where we are now. What is the narrative of this past year? What is the big storyline or the through storylines of Joe Biden's first year as president? And Ashley, since you're in the dark, you can start first, and then we'll.
Sure. So I think one of the lines of his presidency is sort of that he ran explicitly and implicitly to be the anti-Trump, right? Kind of steady, stable, strong, competent, almost boring. And it's interesting. That's why Donald Trump's nickname for him, Sleepy Joe, didn't really, during the campaign, it didn't really take off, and it didn't really hurt him because a sleepy president sounded kind of great to a lot of the country. And I think the narrative has been, because of some errors on the administration's part and because of some things out of their control, sort of the erosion of that sense of President Biden. And I would argue that it actually starts with his withdrawal from Afghanistan, which was something that was very popular in theory with the public. The public did not want Americans in Afghanistan. They wanted to bring young men and women home from these forever wars. But the way that the withdrawal went down, it was, as you all remember, it was chaotic, it was messy. I'm sure we can all remember watching those images of the Kabul airport of Afghan nationals clinging to the wheels and the wings of US military aircrafts. It felt chaotic. It felt like we suddenly had to pay attention to the news. I will say for myself, personally, it felt very much like what it felt like to be a Trump White House reporter. I can remember in the Trump era sitting at the airport with my husband, who also covered Trump actually for the Wall Street Journal, and us finding out that there had been an early morning raid, of Manafort's and Gates's house, and deciding, like, can we responsibly get on this plane to go to a wedding, or do we actually have to come back and cover the news? And when Afghanistan happened, I was on vacation with my family, and it was the first time I was like, wait a minute, do I need to come back from vacation? And I did to write a story, but it felt kind of very Trumpian in certain ways. And since then, there was that there's still COVID, there's inflation, there's tensions with Russia, all the things you guys know. And all of that, when you talk to voters and you look at the polls, I think has eroded, again, that sense of competency. And I would argue that's the through line that I've kind of been thinking about recently in his presidency.
My takeaway from your answer is that you're never allowed to go on vacation again. Sabrina, tell me what your top line analysis of this last year has been.
So I think Ashley makes a lot of great points. I would agree with all of it, really. You know, when you look at the climate in which President Biden came in, it was amid this sheer exhaustion with what had been a very chaotic 4 years under the Trump administration, right? And people were actually looking forward to not really having to pay attention to what the president was doing, or there being a new headline or controversy every other hour of the day. But also, most importantly, Biden came in when we were still in peak pandemic. A winter surge pre-vaccine. The vaccine rollout was really just getting underway. You know, the Trump administration had been very sluggish under their watch. And so, Biden came in with the promise that he would return stability and competence, like Ashley said, but also core to his campaign was that he will lift the nation out of the pandemic. And that was really going to dominate at least the first half of the first year. That's what the White House thought, and they were very optimistic about, the progress that they could make with vaccinations, and then how that would then trigger, this resurgence against the pandemic, and also then help also recover the economy in turn. What that meant, though, was perhaps some overconfidence on their part, because what they did not anticipate, they had a very specific pandemic plan that did not anticipate curveballs, did not anticipate that a faction of the country would refuse to get vaccinated. All of this snowballs, of course, because it also then in turn sets back the economic progress that they did make in those initial months. And so I do think you had this first half of the year where things were very rosy. His approval ratings were high. The vaccination rate was going up. People felt like they're kind of getting a sense of normalcy back. The CDC lifted the mask guidance. Then you hit the summer, and there is this confluence of factors, which includes the very chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan that Ashley was talking about, as well as the Delta wave that clearly the administration did not necessarily prepare for as adequately as they could have, according to most public health experts. And I think the combination of those two is what created this snowball effect, where the second half of the year has looked very different, because now people still don't have a sense of normalcy back. Normalcy is what they, especially with respect to the pandemic, there's still issues with schools being able to remain open. People are still wearing masks. It's, now we have this Omicron wave that's been very disruptive to people's day-to-day lives. Inflation, supply chain issues, all of which are exacerbated by the lingering pandemic. Even if the president doesn't have a lot of control over some of that, when you're president of the United States and people see higher prices at the gas pump, or they see higher prices at the grocery store, they don't see the shelves fully stocked, they're going to blame the president. They're going to blame whoever is in charge. And then finally, of course, there's what has coincided with all of this, because they've had to continue and focus on the pandemic and some of these other crises moments. The legislative agenda has, with the exception of infrastructure, which we'll talk about, has obviously also at the same time remained stalled because of the fact that he has this 50-50 majority. And again, like, it might not be in his control that Senator Joe Manchin or Senator Kirsten Sinema, that they're not coming around to supporting some of the key elements of his economic agenda or voting rights agenda. But again, I think people just feel like the country is on the wrong track, and they don't feel like things have meaningfully improved enough. And that's why you've seen, I think, a very stark contrast in between the first half of his first year and the second half that brings us to where we are today.
Yeah, you talk about his optimism, and particularly as it relates to these legislative setbacks. He ran in part on his mastery of the legislative process, and he gave people a sense that, yeah, we're going to get this done. Some of these big pieces, the Build Back Better Act, the voting rights legislation, notwithstanding the repeated objections of two members of his caucus and the implacable opposition of the Republicans. And yeah, there's no doubt that's hurt him. But Laura, if I'm sitting in the White House and I'm listening to this discussion, I'm thinking, we got 200 million people vaccinated. We cut unemployment by 40%. We cut child poverty significantly. We passed not just the Rescue Act, which was an enormous help to the country through this crisis, but we also passed this bipartisan infrastructure bill that nobody thought could get passed. That is historic in size and scope. Why don't we get any credit for that? The question is, how much of Biden's problems now that the others have mentioned, how much of this was in his control, and how much is he at the mercy of events here?
Well, I think that, clearly, look, the pandemic, he's at the mercy of the pandemic and the mutations that have been occurring with the virus and the need to adapt and respond to those mutations. And the fact that, yes, as Sabrina pointed out, a sizable portion of the country has decided that they don't want to get vaccinated, that they aren't going to wear masks, and they're encouraged to do that by a lot of Republican lawmakers across the states and also in Congress. There's Republicans in Congress who don't want to wear masks or disclose if they've been vaccinated themselves. So that is totally out of the president's control. Same with the fact that he is dealing with a 50-50 Senate. Democrats, if you had asked them going into the 2020 election that they were going to win the Senate, I don't think they would have said that they were going to win it. And, no one expected the Georgia runoff to necessarily go the way it did. And so they did gain control, but it's the slimmest of majorities that Biden has. And even though the president and the White House does love to draw comparisons to LBJ and to FDR in his ability to respond to these huge issues of the day and this unprecedented moment that he's entered the White House in, they don't have the majorities that either of those presidents had. And so that's also out of his control. That being said, actually brought up the fact that he did run on his Senate career and that he was this person who has, a historian that I was talking to the other day brought up the point that Biden entered the White House with more, public service experience than any other president to have entered the White House, at this point. And that experience can be good. It can also mean that I think sometimes he gets the White House gets very bogged down in the process. And I think that they are also still struggling to figure out how to maneuver this Democratic Party that has very different factions, that doesn't fall in line the same way the Republican Party does. And how can he show the public that he is getting legislative wins while navigating this party that has, people as far to the middle, slightly to center right as Senator Joe Manchin, and also as far to the left as independent Bernie Sanders. And so, one thing that the White House will say is, which I'm sure Ashley and Sabrina have heard as well, is that, yeah, they understand there's a disconnect that's happening right now. 2022 is going to be all about where the pandemic is at that point, how people are feeling in terms of, their economic stability and their ability to return to some kind of normal. And the White House understands that that's really what it's going to be all about. And they understand that so far messaging on the part of Democrats and, on their part has not been as strong as it could be in terms of actually explaining all the little things that they have done to try to bring the country back, from this economic brink and also back to more normal. And so you're starting to see the White House and Democrats become more forceful, whether it's in countering Republican attacks or in trying to go out and travel in the country more and explain exactly what he's doing on all of these issues that are very important to the Democratic base. And I think entering this second year, we're going to be seeing more of that, more of them traveling across the country to take their case.
Can I actually just jump off of something Laura said and ask you a question,
Yes,
Ax,
please,
I'd be
please,
curious
please.
about, which is, you sort of touched on what I think we've all noticed was Biden truly believed, and potentially with good reason, that he could come to Washington and bring bipartisanship back, right? Get the Senate to work. And yesterday, very much, he said in his press conference, there was a through line that jumped out to me about this idea that all Republicans want is to obstruct, right? Like, what are they for? What do they stand for? And he twice kind of said it in a way that seemed very sincere to me, that he was sort of almost bewildered at this idea that Republicans would exist only to prevent him from getting anything done. And I believe he believes that and feels that deeply. But my question for you is sort of like, why? Because when he was Obama's VP for 8 years, I mean, that Republicans had a secret meeting on Inauguration Day for Obama to literally say, our goal is this man, this president will never succeed. Biden witnessed that firsthand. And I sort of haven't been able to square why he would then find that so surprising when it happened to him.
No, it's a good question. I think that Barack Obama was new to Washington. He wasn't of the Senate in the way that Biden was of the Senate. And I think that Biden really genuinely believed that these relationships that he had could be mined. And look, give him credit. He did get this infrastructure bill done. He did get that signed. But ultimately, this is about power. And the route to, I think that McConnell, McCarthy, believe that the route back to power is to exploit public discontent about Biden. And so, cooperation isn't necessarily in their interest. And by the way, they're under pressure from their own base not to cooperate with Biden. But my question back to you guys is, this is a turn. And I think strategically there's an argument for it. If this election in a year when there's a 28% wrong track, it may get better. Biden has to hope it will get better. Maybe the virus recedes. Maybe inflation gets better. But if this is just a report card on Biden, the midterm could be as brutal for him as it was for us in 2010. Probably not numerically, but with loss of one or both chambers. But this message that he delivered yesterday was really in contrast with the message that he ran on, as Ashley suggested. And is there still this tension between Biden, the guy who says I can make this work and get things done, versus Biden, who's saying all the Republicans want to do is obstruct and you can't put them back in office? Sabrina.
Well, I think, as Laura pointed out, you are seeing this pivot, right, in the way that he's messaging the politics here in Washington, being more forceful in his attacks on Republicans. And I think some of that is just characteristic of we're getting toward a midterm election year. These very, very slim majorities that Democrats have in both the House and the Senate are at risk. I think they're expecting to lose both. So you kind of go into attack dog mode a little bit more. But I also think that, yes, there's this clear sense now that outside of the infrastructure bill, which to your point was a very significant accomplishment to have this major bipartisan piece of legislation that his predecessors had tried and failed to achieve, pass, with Republican support, there really isn't anything else that Republicans are going to give him. And he knows that. That's why they were using this reconciliation process for his Build Back Better, his domestic economic agenda, because they knew that they thought they would be able to do it with only Democratic votes. Turns out you don't have that either. But I think that, one thing that is important to put into context as well is, yes, Biden's approval ratings are at, their lowest for him. Still higher than where Trump was at this year, but low, second lowest, frankly, among, presidents in recent history.
Not where you want to be.
Not where you want to be. Whether or not he had gotten more done, it's still unclear that would have been enough for midterms, because look, if past is precedent, whoever is in the White House, especially a new president, those initial midterms, we've seen this play out under his predecessors too, tend to trigger just a backlash to whoever is in charge, right? We saw that happen under President Trump. He lost the House in 2018. Obviously, President Obama lost first the House in 2010, sorry, and then the
In fact,
Senate.
let me just interrupt to say that it's only been twice since World War II that the governing party has not lost seats.
Right, exactly. So I do want to just kind of have that context, because I know it's sort of easy right now to kind of zero in on Biden's woes. I'm not sure that we would have necessarily seen different results if they had passed the Build Back Better bill. But I do think that, because you asked the question about why the sense of the White House, they don't seem to be getting credit for what they have done. I think, again, because the pandemic is just so disruptive to people's lives, that's really front and center. Again, because of the impact it's had on the economy with inflation, that's what people feel. They don't feel the benefits of an infrastructure bill yet. And that's not going to be something that's as tangible to the average American for a very long time. And what would have probably been more tangible is if they were able to run on what was in their Build Back Better package, which was expanding access to healthcare, elder care, childcare, things that people actually, that actually affects their life at home, their day-to-day costs, their personal economic circumstances. So I think, that's what's going to be challenging for them in midterms is, it's not surprising that he will talk about Republicans as obstructionists. But I think if passed as president, that won't be sufficient enough as a message, and infrastructure probably won't be as much of a selling point as they want it to be, because it's just not something that's tangible for the average American at this particular point in time.
Laura, on this question of running on the obstructionist of Republicans, obstructionism of Republicans, is that seems a little nebulous. On the other hand, you see, McCarthy, Kevin McCarthy, who's likely to be Speaker of the House, saying we're going to essentially take vengeance on people who have bedeviled us. Adam Schiff, we're going to take him off of the Intelligence Committee. We're going to, and he named a few other people. And there are Republicans talking about impeachment. The grounds are not clear, but isn't there at a time when people feel unsettled? Is there not a political message about what life will be like under the House Republicans if they get elected? I mean, I don't know that will work either, to be honest with you. I think this is being governed by larger forces, but I don't know where Biden went yesterday is pointed enough about the future.
Yeah.
Then, to make an actual difference to anybody who's voting.
Well, yeah, you're hitting on something that, I've had a conversation like this with so many, like either Democratic lawmakers or Democratic operatives and those who are preparing for the 2020 cycle. And, there are a lot of Democrats out there who tell me that they don't think Biden and the White House have been just aggressive and totally, out there in terms of their attacks on Republicans and shaping this very clear picture about threats to democracy. Now, we've seen in this month that the White House has started to take that on in a more full-throated attack. We saw it in the January 6th speech, where the president laid out in very dire terms what he sees as urgent and, dangerous attacks on the Republic. And he continued that in his speech in Atlanta, which I was at in Atlanta, Georgia, where he tried to ask Republicans and Democrats alike, what do you want to be remembered for? The White House does like to really turn to the, historical comparisons and parallels in this argument where they say, do you want to be on the side of Bull Connor or George Wallace, or do you want to be on the side of
controversial, actually, line of his?
Yeah. Yes. Among Republicans, right, who tried to say that he was saying that they were exactly Bull Connor when he was asking them, when you vote on this, who do you want to be remembered as? And so,
of course, the answer, if they gave an honest answer to that, they'd say, I want to be remembered as the guy who got, or gal who got elected in 2020, reelected in 2022. I mean, that would be the answer.
It probably is. Yeah, that probably is the honest answer. But, I think that there are Democrats who feel as though there could be a much more coherent, cohesive argument about the obstruction from Republicans, but also about the the entire web of what occurred on January 6th, what led up to it, and what has come from it, which is the continuation of lies about election fraud, which is the continuation of lies about a stolen election. And, and they want to see people held accountable for it. Democrats do, and base voters that I talk to do. Now, the problem is how much can Biden convince those independents and moderates that he got during the last cycle that this is, a do or die moment for the Republic, and that this is an argument that can do well for Democrats down ballot in 2022. In states like Georgia, it might do very well because that is what it's all about in that state. In other states, I'm not so sure yet. I'm sure pretty soon, Ashley, Sabrina, and I are going to start trying to travel across the country and really figure out where voters' minds are at. But
let me just say to that I think what you're going to find is that voters' minds are very much focused on the things that are right in front of them in their lives, the virus and the limitations the virus has placed on them, inflation and the cost of things. And that's the problem, is that these arguments, I appreciate them, but they are, in the minds of a lot of those voters, I think, a distraction from the things that are most significant in their lives. Ashley, you're the veteran of two White Houses. I wouldn't necessarily, peculiar circumstances in each case, but a lot has been said here, and a lot has been said generally about communications, and this notion that the White House hasn't communicated effectively a lot about how the COVID issue has been relayed to the country and the steps around COVID and so on. How much of that, how valid a critique is that, and how would you evaluate the fundamental communications from the administration?
It's a good question. President Biden addressed this a little bit in his press conference yesterday, but that even he kind of spoke about the White House is always a bubble. It's always an insular place, right? But it is sort of made more so by coronavirus, especially with an older president who is very, very understandably cautious about it. And also someone made this point to me, but I think it's a fair one, the physical insecurity that January 6th brought, right? So they really come in this fortress-like mentality. And one of Biden's political superpowers is his empathy. It truly is. And I do think, and we wrote a lot about how Trump always goes to Mar-a-Lago and Bedminster. We've written a lot about how Biden goes to Wilmington. But one thing I have heard from his aides in talking about that is one of the reasons he loves to go to Wilmington is because it's like this one chance he gets outside of the bubble, and he's in his house, but his neighbors are dropping by, and the plumber's coming by, and someone's coming by to fix the furnace, and aides report getting calls from him in Wilmington in real time, where he's like, hey, the guy who just came by to fix this told me that, this bill we're passing doesn't solve that problem that he and all his union buddies have. What can we do about it? And I do think he is missing that, which makes it a little harder to communicate about some of these things. And I think there's also a recognition in talking to people in the White House that they were often talking about, again, sort of like top line things. We're doing this about meat and poultry producers, but what sort of voters want to know is all the ways in which inflation and supply chain issues and the virus is affecting them. It's so immediate, right? It's what you drive, if you can get a car, and what it costs to fill up gas. It's how much milk and meat costs at the grocery store. It's mortgages and rents. And I do think they need to do, and they have admitted, so I say this based on reporting, that they need to do, and I am a parent of 2 kids, but one is under 5, right? And it's not enough to kind of say for those parents, you hear from them, oh, well, a vaccine's on the way, and here's why the Pfizer vaccine didn't work, and this is the FDA process. Like, they want to know, like, they are losing their minds, they want someone who can kind of speak to that. And that is very much something the administration recognizes they need to do a better job on. And one final brief thing I was struck by is, and again, there's also a sense what voters often want. I mean, we talk about people vote for who you would get a beer with, but they also want someone who just conveys kind of strength and confidence and optimism. And I was talking to a pollster who said, look, the American people can handle just about everything. We're resilient. Like, as long as we know that better times are ahead. It's kind of this uncertainty and up and down. And in Washington focus group, there was one voter who said, that Biden seems kind of weak. He's more like a supporting actor. And they said, like, look, former President Trump, even when he was wrong, he was just so confident, which, like, you can argue is actually somewhat dangerous for the president to be very wrong and very confident. But that is another thing that, for whatever reason, it feels like voters are looking to Biden for and not really getting, at least until recently, when his tone has kind of changed.
Well, that's part of the thing about being the antithesis to Trump. I mean, and, I think his age plays into it. But, President Clinton famously once said, strong and wrong beats weak and right. And at a time when things are feel like they're out of control, people want to feel like the president's in command. And that, I'm sure that plays into some of this. Sabrina, but it's not just the president's not the only messenger in an administration. And it's been sort of notable to me that he has been carrying the ball a lot, other than the CDC director, and a few others. I mean, you don't see a lot of players on the field, occasionally Secretary Buttigieg, but how do you evaluate the cabinet and their strength generally and their strength as communicators?
Well, I think it's interesting because one of the themes that we saw early on, and this goes back to this idea of bringing back experience, competence, stability, that's very much what the Biden cabinet was also supposed to reflect, right? There were a lot of picks who had been around Washington for a really long time, like Secretary Blinken. People, Secretary Vilsack came back to his previous post as agriculture secretary, people who were known entities and who didn't draw a lot of opposition or weren't seen as particularly controversial nominees. Quite a few of them got support from Republicans even in order to be confirmed. So, I think that what's happened since then, this White House is very structured. They're very traditional, where you've seen several times they'll bring one of the cabinet secretaries out to the podium with Jen Psaki because today we want to talk about climate. And today we wanted to talk about transportation. And so that's when, they bring these people out. I don't know how much the average American is consuming of that. That's something that's more, something that we are seeing as reporters. I would say that it's just that I don't know that you've necessarily seen a lot of them in a really prominent way. And part of that is just because I think it goes back to this idea that this is a presidency that has largely been overtaken by events. So despite their desire to, very much have this structure and coordinated way of messaging around a specific topic on that day, what's looming over them is, foreign policy crises that remain a challenge. It was Afghanistan, now it's Russia and this possible incursion into Ukraine. There was obviously the conflict in Gaza in May. So when you have seen Secretary Blinken, it's in a moment of crisis and it's more reactive. With the CDC and the COVID, again, like a lot of times the pandemic is still not under control. And now we need someone to go out there and explain, and it's all very confusing for people to understand. So that person is in an impossible job. So I just don't think that they've, despite their desire to stay on message and to have the cabinet secretaries kind of line up on any given day to sell whatever it is they're trying to sell, they haven't, because of all these problems we've been talking about, namely pandemic and economy with some, with the side of foreign policy, it's just been much more difficult for them to maintain that structure. And therefore, that's why I think you haven't seen like the cabinet quite as visible as they otherwise perhaps would have been.
If I could add something,
Yeah.
Yeah, it's also that, this White House, actually, I'd be curious if you think it was similar in the Obama years, which I think it was to a degree, but they've also centralized a lot of power inside the White House. So you have Gina McCarthy and John Kerry, right, who arguably are out front far more than the EPA director. You have Jeff Zients, who was within the White House, coordinating COVID. You have Gene Sperling, who's handling, the implementation of things far more than some of the cabinet secretaries. Now you have Mitch Landrieu inside the White House, overseeing the doling out of the infrastructure funding. That's not to say the cabinet secretaries aren't present and aren't doing their job, but far more of the public faces are those who are have positions inside the White House, whether it's czars or, coordinators. And, one notable absence from a lot of the front-facing coronavirus response is Health and Human Services Secretary Javier Becerra. We don't really
why is that?
Well, that's a good question. But, we don't see him as much. And part of that, it's hard to tell. There was reports early on, I think we reported, Washington Post, others have reported that, there was tension in that relationship between Becerra and Biden and how to totally handle the pandemic and who were the best messengers. And so I think that's part of why we see him a lot less. In terms of when infrastructure was going through the House and the Senate, there were about 5 cabinet secretaries, but arguably more, 2 to 3, that were really front and center working with Republicans. I'm talking about Buttigieg, Secretary Buttigieg, as well as Secretary Gina Raimondo, who's become, kind of like a Republican whisperer. A lot of Republican senators really love her. And so.
You muted.
Somehow you got muted, Laura.
Notes on the dynamics between the cabinet and the inner circle that I think are interesting.
Yeah. One of the, on the Becerra issue, the thing that makes it peculiar, and, the same with the Secretary of Treasury, the 2 biggest issues facing the country are the pandemic and inflation. And you don't really see them out there very much, communicating on the 2 line secretaries. Yeah, Sabrina.
Really quickly, I'll say on that, there's some, reports, as Laura said, about, some tensions in that relationship early on. But with Becerra, the other piece here is this White House really wanted to kind of do a course correction from the previous administration on COVID, which had obviously, in the Trump administration, as we know, politicized the CDC, put a lot of pressure on the scientists there. And so I think there was really an effort here to elevate the CDC and make them the kind of central player in the pandemic in terms of a lot of the messaging, for better or for worse. So that on the one hand, they can say with CDC, the scientists are back in charge, and they actually decided not to have HHS. HHS is doing a lot of the coordination for a lot of the programs in terms of, getting masks out, distributing testing, distributing masks, a lot of the logistical things that we've seen with the vaccine rollout. But they sort of wanted the messaging to come more so from the CDC, again, to sort of have this concept of elevating the scientists. And there was some criticism that Secretary Becerra did not have the experience actually for the specific job he was given. And so I think that was another element of it where, they pushed back against that when they nominated him. But perhaps I think there is a sense that for an ever-changing pandemic that's thrown a lot of curveballs their way, he may not have the kind of experience to be the sort of chief messenger on television, and when a lot of it has to do with changing science and changing guidelines, and that being really the focus of where the pandemic stands today.
You guys mentioned earlier we dealt with expectations, and I want to ask all of you, how much is the wrangling with the president was very optimistic about Build Back Better from the beginning, that he would be able to prevail there. He even as late as last week, raised expectations with the fervor of his speech, at least, about voting rights. As you talk to Democrats, active Democrats. How much problem has that created? The sort of expectations that things were going to get done and then not getting them done, rather than starting from the beginning and acknowledging that these were going to be big hurdles to overcome. Go ahead, Laura.
I mean, I can go, sorry. Well, I think that, in the lead up to what we've seen this shift at the beginning of this year, as you mentioned, Axe, but, Biden throughout the course of last year did make reference to the fact that if I were to try to do voting rights right now, I wouldn't have the support for it, because he very clearly wanted to give some wins to the mansions and get this bipartisan win. And he wanted to give some wins to the mansions of the world. And he did. I mean, Manchin and Sinema, the two Democratic senators, from Arizona and West Virginia, they really wanted that bipartisan infrastructure bill, and they got it. And when you talk to those in the White House, they felt as though, and Biden even said this on a CNN town hall, he said, if I were to push too hard on changing the filibuster for voting rights, or to push too hard on voting rights right now, I would lose the votes that I need for my economic agenda. Now, he lost the votes for the Build Back Better part anyways. He did not get those in December. But, I think that the White House finally reached a point, because they were under so much pressure from civil rights leaders, from, Black Lives Matter activists, from voting rights activists all across the country, and from a lot of Democratic lawmakers, that you just have to use the bully pulpit, make the strongest.
I think we've lost your audio again.
Thing.
Oh, there you go. I think you're back.
Oh, okay. Sorry. So I think that the White House reached a point where they were under so much pressure from all of the activists, the advocates. My internet is not doing very well right now.
You're okay. You're doing fine. Yeah, they felt that they had to.
That they had to make. Yeah, that they had to make the strongest case they could possibly make.
Does the failure? Will that impede him in terms of turnout in November?
I don't think so, only because when I've gone to Georgia and when I've traveled to some of these other states, and have talked to base Democratic voters, they wanted to see Biden put everything on the line, even if he wasn't successful. They want to see him and Harris make the strongest argument possible, and to pressure Manchin and Sinema, even if it isn't successful. I mean, Majority Whip Jim Clyburn told me last summer that Biden needed to get on the phone and corner Manchin and try to push him on the filibuster. Now, Biden and the White House have tried to do that. A lot of Democratic senators have tried to do that. It hasn't been successful. But you're starting to hear from a lot of advocates, and I think from base Democratic voters, that they were happy that Biden is being so aggressive on that.
Manchin may be happy too, because his numbers improved greatly in West Virginia. Ashley, one of the things that Biden promised was to restore decency and integrity to the White House, to change the tenor. He's done that. Isn't that fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely.
And does that accrue to his benefit at all?
I mean, I don't know, right? And in a certain way, I think because Trump has lost his Twitter feed, that there's sort of not that stark of a contrast as people like I think the American public very quickly sort of, even as a journalist who set an alarm at 6:15, 6:30, 6:45, and 7 a.m. so I could be ready to file off of Trump's latest tweets. You sort of forget what that moment and what that era was like when you can kind of just ignore it in certain ways. So I do wonder if that lack of a contrast maybe accrues less of appreciation for what Biden is doing. And actually, this is top of mind because I have a story about this posting tomorrow, but I think one of the reasons why Republicans were so outraged by the comments we mentioned earlier, where Biden said, talking about voting rights, which side of history do you want to be on, right? Do you want to be Bull Connor or George Wallace or Jefferson Davis? Was that that sort of wasn't his brand and that wasn't his tone. And the idea that he would kind of come in, and there's a fair point that like he was making a pretty broad rhetorical point about racial progress, and it's not actually that controversial, right? But you know, it felt to some of these Republicans that he was calling them traitors, he was calling them segregationalists, he was calling them racists. And that felt sort of so out of character for the Joe Biden, who they very much are trying to thwart at every turn, but kind of still appreciate that decorum, that they were kind of startled. And I think that's why you saw those outraged response from people like Mitch McConnell and Mitt Romney.
Yeah. Sabrina, I'm going to just ask this last question. I'm going to turn it over to Tara to introduce you to all the people who want to ask questions themselves. Laura mentioned the vice president. But we don't hear that much from the vice president, and she's taken quite a bit of incoming over the last year. How would you evaluate the year for her, and to the degree that you feel she's had problems, to what do you ascribe them?
You know, I think that she's been given a very challenging set of issues. Immigration. You could not find a more complex issue to hand to your vice president because there are no good answers. And we already know that immigration reform is not happening on Capitol Hill. And it's not something that the White House has put a priority on in terms of legislation. And a lot of the discretion, frankly, with respect to obviously with respect to executive orders, falls with the president. You know, a lot of the issues that we're seeing around asylum seekers or some of the Trump era restrictions, some he's overturned, some are still in place. There's not much that Vice President Kamala Harris can do about that. And so she instead is put out there in this position of having to go to Central America or having to be out there when there is a surge at the border, or there's, this when you saw the conditions that the Haitian migrants were trapped in the way in which the Border Patrol agents were mistreating them. You know, these are, there's no good explanation for any of it. And so I think, and then the other issue, obviously, that he gave her was voting rights. Again, an issue that they didn't put much of a priority on, as Laura was pointing out earlier in the year or last year, because they had their eye on other legislative priorities. And so a lot of what Kamala Harris was doing was more so focused on messaging, but not really any meaningful action that she could put behind it. So I think some of it's just been, she's been dealt a tough set of cards. But then, of course, communication wise, hasn't always been the most effective communicator. And I think that's, there have been a number of interviews where there have been missteps on her part, and they've had to go out there and clarify or play cleanup. She's had a lot of staff turnover. Some of it, you see it after 1 year in. Some of it seems a little bit at a higher rate than you might otherwise expect. So I think that, some of the challenges are more with messaging and communication within her office. And then, like I said, I think some of it is just, he has not given her the role that he had, to kind of be a chief negotiator going over to the Hill, relying on experience. I mean, she was in the Senate, not nearly as long as he was, but when he was vice president, but she did come from the Senate. She hasn't been, she's been more so been given issues that she doesn't have a whole lot of control over. And that, I guess voting rights may be an interesting test now, given that's one of her two primary issues, to see how much of a prominent role she plays in the possibility of them getting something done.
Either of you guys want to pipe up on that one?
One thing on Kamala, I think is, two brief things. One is, I always think, Axelrod knows my first job, I was Maureen Dowd's research assistant. And one thing she said that stuck with me is that the candidates who win are the ones who have people who will crawl through glass for them. And in some ways that was true of Obama. When all of those young aides moved out to Iowa and New Hampshire, no one thought he was going to win. They just really believed in him and thought it would be a crazy experience. And that's why it felt like in the Obama administration, there was such pride in the people who could say, I was the #1 hire in New Hampshire. I was the 4th person to arrive in Des Moines. And when I look at the vice president, throughout her career, there are so few people who have ever moved with her and stayed with her, from the attorney general's office to the Senate, from the Senate office to the campaign, to to the vice president's office, and a lot have left to the vice president's office. And I do think that reflects, I don't quite entirely know what's caused it. We've done some reporting on it, as have others, but I do think that's sort of like an endemic challenge that belies a problem at the top. But the other thing I will say, which is what her people say, but I think it's a fair argument, is that, again, as the first female Black vice president, she faces a lot of racist headwinds. And I was watching a focus group of suburban swing voters who were asked some questions about her. And, you know, these were all people who said they were so excited about the promise of her. And a lot of the stuff they said just kind of felt blatantly racist to me, or something that a white man would not have to deal with, such as, you know, she's just, I'm paraphrasing, but pretty close to verbatim, you know, I don't know what she's doing. She's just sitting in the back of the room, like laughing, collecting a paycheck. She's lazy. And when the moderator asked, you know, well, what sorts of things could the vice president do to make you have a better opinion of her? They actually listed things that she's literally done. They said, well, she could go to the border, you know, she could stop being lazy and go to the border and help the president there. Well, she's done that, right? She's the emissary. They said she could do events like this, sort of like small listening sessions. That's like half of what she does. And so I did get the sense that there's many self-inflicted wounds in that office, but there's also just a lot of tailwinds that other people who are not women of color in powerful positions have to deal with.
Laura, I'm not going to ask you to comment because I'll be committing a self-inflicted wound if I don't get to these questions.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Great to be with you. And Tara, take it away.
All right. Thank you so much. So the first question comes from Rohil Saxena, who's a first year in the college, and he is going to ask his question live on video.
Yeah, hi. Like Tara said, my name is Rohil. I'm a first year in the college. So I had a question regarding voting rights. So like these kind of same tactics have been used by Republicans in the past. It's not necessarily a new thing. And Democrats have been able to get enough voter turnout to win elections in the past. So my question is, like, don't you think it's more important to bolster things like the Electoral Count Act to prevent like events that we saw last year, not at the expense of voting rights legislation, but like maybe the Electoral Count Act should be farther ahead on the list, like the agenda items?
I'm happy to chime in. So, yeah, there is a debate among some Democrats about what exactly should be the central focus, whether it's the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act, which was gutted in 2013 by the Supreme Court. You know, some will argue that that's the most important thing, simply because it would be a proactive attempt to stop laws such as the ones that were passed in Georgia and in Texas, because of that pre-clearance authority, which means that the DOJ would have to give these states pre-approval before they pass these restrictive voting laws. So a lot of congressional Black lawmakers consider that to be one of the most important things that could be passed, because of the way it can provide a check on these state legislatures when they try to pass these laws. But, you know, I've talked to election law experts who will say that anti-subversion legislation, not just the Electoral Count Act, though, and not just reforming it, they think it needs to be bigger, is incredibly important. And so changes to the Electoral Count Act, like you mentioned, would definitely fortify that law and potentially prevent the exploitation that Trump and his allies tried to exert, you know, in the last election cycle, which is to present a different slate of electors, you know, do away with the results that were presented on the fake basis of election fraud. But, you know, election law experts say it needs to be bigger than that. Even just fortifying the Electoral Count Act of 1887, they argue isn't really enough. There have to be within that legislation, if that is the route that lawmakers ultimately go down. And right now there are bipartisan conversations happening between Senate Republicans, a small, very tiny group of Senate Republicans, and a small group of Senate Democrats on the Electoral Count Act. You know, law experts argue that it needs to be broader, though. There need to be provisions in there that exert penalties on people who threaten election officials, people who try to, subvert the results in any way, shape, or form. There have to be real consequences and penalties on those actors, regardless of what position they are in. And so, what is ultimately more important? I mean, you'll see experts argue that anti-subversion, but bigger than the Electoral Count Act, is what Democrats should prioritize right now over, a bill like Freedom to Vote that, handles partisan gerrymandering or tries to make Election Day a national holiday.
Okay. Ashley, Sabrina. Oh, thank you, Rohil. Next question comes from Ellen Feinstein, who's on UChicago staff, and I will read this on her behalf. With the midterms looming and the likely shift of ruling party, how can the administration take a winning, or otherwise known as aggressive, messaging approach to ensure that Democrats don't take a shellacking in November? Ashley, you want to start since you're off of mute?
Sure. I mean, it's a great question, but it's one that the Democrats in the White House is still trying to figure out the answer to. I mean, one charitable theory I've heard is that like Biden just hit his kind of approval rating low, like he's precocious, right? And so normally when you hit this in the summer, then you get totally shellacked in the midterms, but he kind of plummeted so much earlier than expected that they had some time to dig out. Again, I think you saw a little bit of the Biden strategy previewed at his press conference yesterday, again, where he said sort of, what do Republicans stand for? Name me a single thing they stand for. I think we'll hear a lot about that. But again, the political headwinds are just fundamentally against him. And I think they can change things in the margin here or there, but a lot of it, is there another variant, right? That's largely out of his control. Like, do prices go down? Because again, there's a lot of really positive economic indicators, but they're not the ones when you go to the grocery store and the shelves are either bare or like $2 more than you typically pay for eggs.
Yeah, I think, it is harder this time around because we're still in the throes of a pandemic that changes the politics and the climate in a way that previous presidents were not dealing with in midterm elections. So a lot of the typical playbook that you would see a president deploy and a president and his party deploy in midterms doesn't necessarily work against the backdrop of people still seeing these disruptions to their day-to-day lives. I think we were talking earlier a little bit about this urgency the White House is now putting behind Republicans as obstructionists, but then also talking a little bit about democracy being at stake with the whole issue, the issue of election subversion. I think that the latter part of that, when they talk about January 6th and they talk about the, threat to democracy and a lot of these, Trumpian Republicans who are still casting doubt on the election, and, a lot of these the laws that Republicans have passed across the country to restrict access to the ballot, that's a little harder, I think, to rally people behind because, this, first of all, every time there's election, even if it may be more real now, every time there's election, they say there's an existential threat, this is the most important election of your lifetime. And so now people actually kind of groan. And also it's just not as tangible, like we were saying. And like Ashley was saying, it's not as tangible to talk about, this more philosophical debate over democracy than it is the economy and COVID and what's actually impacting people personally. So I really do think that, now if they do lean more into, it might be more successful if they lean more into the fact that Republicans, as Ashley said, what is it that they actually stand for, and lean into this idea that, they don't want to expand access to healthcare. They don't want to make it easier to pay for childcare costs. They don't want to help, lower your cost of living. They're not actually trying to do anything to help you. That may be more effective than this sort of, even if maybe much more urgent conversation around democracy and election subversion. But again, I do think, to Ashley's point, it'll fundamentally just be about what do prices look like? What does inflation look like? And more importantly, do people feel like they have normalcy back? When you get closer to midterms, are schools, are a number of schools virtual? Are they not? Are kids wearing masks in school? Are they not? Are people feeling like they can travel again? Are people still having to isolate? Are there massive staff shortages because there's another variant? I really think that will override really any of the traditional messaging that you would see in midterms.
And very briefly, just to jump on that, they have an even bigger challenge of the pure Republicans are obstructing everything, because two of the major people are members of their own party, Manchin and Sinema, who just get outsized attention from the White House. Fairly or unfairly, they get outsized attention from the media. So again, it's hard to say it's Republicans when a lot of the stories are, focused on, can Biden get Manchin on board? Biden goes to the Hill and Sinema embarrasses him with a speech, right? It takes away that sort of like clear hit, right? Because it's like, well, Republicans are obstructing him. And, Democrats that won in states where Trump won by 40, and, Sinema, like, it's not the clean, like, oppo hit you would want.
All right, thank you. Next, we have a question from Nick Koch, who will ask his question live on video.
Hi, my name is Nick Koch. My University of Chicago affiliation is that I am the proud father of one of your graduate students finishing up the semester, and a IOP colleague, Laura Koch. You'll notice we have a difficult last name for Democrats. As a matter of fact, a while back, I was at a fundraiser for Al Franken in Minneapolis, and he did a real double take at my name tag. In Minneapolis, we've just come through a very fraught municipal election, all kinds of issues that you may either know or can imagine. And so my question for you has to do with local versus national politics, and the long-term efforts of those Koch brothers to work much, much more at the local and state legislative levels. So that's what I'm worried about. Democrats focusing too much on the national stage and not so much at the boring school board and state legislatures. What say you all, and how can we offset this imbalance? Thanks very much.
Well, I guess what I would say is that, we've seen in the recent speeches, Biden trying to highlight those changes that are occurring at the state and local level, whether it's people running for Secretary of State office or people on local election boards. And so you are hearing some Democrats, who work for the party, be it, they work for the DNC in a certain state, or they work for different advocacy groups that are trying to highlight what exactly is happening at the local level and which candidates and what platforms they're running on. There's candidates in Georgia that are running on platforms saying that they aren't going to certify, that they wouldn't have certified the 2020 election. And, implicit in that is that they won't certify future elections. So I think you're seeing more and more Democrats at the local level trying to highlight those issues, and the fact that really it happens from, dog catcher on up in terms of what impact there can be on the election process. Who is running for these very specific, and who is getting pushed out, and who is getting put onto these election board, very local county level election board positions, because they could very well have an impact on whether future results are certified, especially in a presidential, which is where that would come more into effect. And again, you do hear from other movement groups like Black Lives Matter and other groups, a big focus, particularly in terms of police reform, on the local level, because that's where they feel that the biggest impact can be made versus national legislation, given that so much is centralized, within the states and within different counties and cities. Yeah.
All right, thanks. The next question is on behalf of Anthony Calixto, who is a first year in the college. And Anthony asks, is there anything that the Biden administration can do to stop inflation, and what are the effects of such actions?
You know, it's challenging because so this is sort of the age-old question, and it's not unique to President Biden. You know, there was a point I recall in the Obama administration where gas prices were up, and you know, Republicans seized on it as a political issue, and there wasn't much President Obama could do about it either. You know, and I think inflation that we're seeing right now is very much a consequence of a pandemic that is now coming up on 2 years. And the longer that we're in it, the harder it gets to overcome it. And I know, you know, especially at the Wall Street Journal, where we have fortunately a good bench of economic reporters, when they talk to economists, what they do hear is that frankly, presidents have very little control over inflation. And in fact, you know, there was a move by President Biden to sort of release reserves. It's called the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. I don't want to get in the weeds too much, but to try and boost supply of oil and make lower gas prices with action on his own. And that was actually met with quite a bit of criticism, because typically that's not something that presidents do. So I think that's one of the challenges, is that there's actually not a whole lot that is in his control. Now they're sort of trying to argue that some of the legislation that they've already pursued, whether it's infrastructure or, you know, their economic agenda, that it would help lower costs for Americans overall. But I don't think that would necessarily address the inflation issue and prices that people are seeing on the shelves or at the gas pump. So it is but I will say what's interesting, you know, you've seen President Biden try and not completely pass the buck. I think when he's given a number of speeches on this, and he does sort of acknowledge that pain. And he does say, like, I know that you guys are not always able to get what you want to get. You know, you can't find it on the shelves, or you can't find it online. It's out of stock. I understand that frustration. I know that you're seeing higher prices when you go to the grocery store. So he's at least trying to acknowledge that people are very much experiencing that pain when it comes to higher prices. But I do think that he's limited in what he can do. Having said that, the reality for any president is people see higher prices and they're going to blame whoever's in charge. But it probably just speaks again to how much they really need to get this pandemic under control, because that is the only thing that will help reset the economy. According to most economists, until and when we're back to some sense of normal, the inflation and supply with respect to pandemic, the inflation and supply chain issues are likely going to persist, especially because it's a global problem. You know, it affects not just the supply; it's a global supply chain issue. And so I think that's really the biggest challenge they have, and the only way out, even if it's not something he can directly control himself.
All right, thank you. And we have one last question. This one comes from Annie Henderson, who's a first-year MPP at Harris, and Annie will ask her question live on video. Oh, Annie, we can't hear you.
No.
No. I can grab it for you from the chat. So Annie's question is, I'm curious if you see this first year affecting whether or not Biden runs for a second term, and if so, in what ways?
So I will start and say, I think one thing that was fascinating to me was I was overseas recently for a journalism thought leader forum. So it's a lot of people who are like editors of newspapers, kind of diplomat-y types, etc. And everyone was asking me, as one of the few people from the United States who covered the White House, if I thought Biden was going to run again. And every time I said that Biden was going to run again, like that, barring like a health catastrophe or something unexpected, Biden was going to run again, everyone acted as if I was doing like a bit, like a piece of kind of visual comedy. And like no one could believe me, to the point where they had to bring in like a male validator, right? They were like, well, David Brooks, what do you think? And like David said the same thing. And then everyone was stunned. So that doesn't totally answer your question, but it was surprising and eye-opening to me, who deals with these Democratic operatives and White House staffers every day, where of course he is going to run, barring something else. I think he is certainly more likely to run also if it looks like Donald Trump may run, because that was very much the origin story of he decided to run after Charlottesville. I think there's maybe a more interesting question if Trump suddenly had a heart attack or in some way was out of the picture in a very clear way, where then I think maybe Biden would consider not running. But I also just, anyone who is in power, like very rarely do they relinquish power, right? All of us can talk about covering Robert Byrd or Thad Cochran when it was very clear that they maybe should have retired earlier. And I'm not saying that's the case with Biden, but just everyone on his team is behaving as if and preparing and talking as if he is going to run. And I don't think a good first year or a bad first year changes that calculation in any way.
Yeah, I want Laura to chime in on this too, but I was just say really quickly, the Trump component is so key here, because Biden's whole premise in his campaign was that he was the only one who could defeat President Trump. That's what he said during the primary, and he was right. Would someone else have certainly lost to Trump? We don't know. That's a hypothetical, but at least he has proven, at least for now, that he is the only Democrat who was able to successfully run against former President Trump. And he even if a lot has changed since the 2020 election, and it's very different being an incumbent president, I think that will really be the driving force here, is to say that I don't think there's anyone else that from his vantage point in the Democratic field who would be able to beat Trump were he to seek office again. And look, there's a lot of again, I want Laura to have a chance to chime in on this, but there's a lot of ups and downs, and a lot can change between now and 2024 in terms of, is Donald Trump going to run again? Right now, it looks like he may well. We don't know if that will be the case. Does something else? Are there some kind of events that prevent Biden from being able to run? And maybe does his presidency look very different? Is he able to actually turn things around and have a very different? I think does he have many more accomplishments to run on the kind of crisis he's in right now? Do things change? Are we looking at a very different landscape in 2024 than we are right now? Right now, the writing on the wall is not very good. It's hard to imagine that he would be reelected were he seek office again. There are polls showing that even a significant percentage of Democrats don't want him to run again. But all of that, a lot can happen. If you look at political cycles, a lot can happen between now and 2023, 2024.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be very brief. I'm not sure I have much more to add to what Ashley and Sabrina said, other than, yes, I mean, like if Trump runs, it would be really difficult for me to imagine Biden not running, given all the reasons that Ashley and Sabrina laid out. Also, I mean, right now, there's a huge question of who really is a successor, who is a clear successor. Like, I know everyone assumes that Harris would step up and run again if Biden were to step aside in 2024, or, if he is in for a full 2 terms, it still is unclear who the successor would be and who would be able to clear the field. And right now, again, we are only a year in, but right now I don't hear any Democrats saying that Vice President Kamala Harris would clear the field if she were to run. There is Pete Buttigieg waiting in the wings. There are a lot of other Democrats out there who would totally potentially run again. If it is 2024, does Elizabeth Warren run again? I mean, we don't know. I'd be surprised if she does, but there are a lot of Democrats out there that are still looking at that. And there's no clear successor. So if it looks like a difficult race in 24, whether it's Trump or not, Democrats may very well rally behind Biden again, which if he says he's running, they would. And also they probably might be grateful that he's running again, because it could be very, they like to avoid, a very bloody, difficult primary. Yeah.
Great. Well, Thank you, Laura, Ashley, and Sabrina for your time and for the thoughtful discussion today. We really appreciate it. It's been a great conversation. Thank you to all who joined from wherever you are and for those who submitted questions. And that concludes our event for today. So hope everyone enjoys the rest of their evening.